This presentation by Dr. Michelle Eley at North Carolina A&T State University is the last of a six-part series in fall of 2020 organized by Fort Valley State University, Dr. Niki Whitley and Stefan Price, and AgriUnity, Mr. Kennedy.
I want to say thank you for the invitation. I had spoken to Dr. Whitley maybe about a month ago, and she had mentioned about this opportunity to share some information with you all as you were thinking about kind of working more collaboratively. So she wanted me to share some information about cooperatives, just kind of go over some baseline things, but even more so important, I think she thought it would be of value to you to hear about some of the steps that we follow within Extension when our growers, and these growers are pork producers, so still working in livestock, but a different species, when they were faced with the dilemma of what to do and looking at the opportunities of working together as a way to really remain solvent in a market that easily can swallow you up, you know. So I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to share. And so like I said, today I'm going to kind of go over some basics with you in terms of why groups form cooperatives, what are some elements that you may want to take in consideration when you're trying to form successfully. Also, we'll be covering briefly some of the pitfalls, obstacles you may want to avoid, and then talk about some best management practices. And in this presentation, of course, like I say, I would integrate some information about how we work with a particular farmer group, because I feel like as farmers, you really benefit from learning from other farmers and their experiences. So I have tried to kind of go back in history and try to track some of that information to make some of these things a little bit more clear. So why form a cooperative? Basically, when we look at cooperatives and why farmers really choose to work collaboratively with other farmers, it really boils down to an economic nature. Because as you know, most farmers love to work independently. You know, they love that autonomy. And by nature, I feel like you feel more comfortable working in that vein. But in cases, you know, sometimes it's more feasible to come together working with other farmers who are like-minded, who are maybe dealing with some of the common issues that you're dealing with, but also benefit from collaborating because there's opportunity in collaboration. And so these are some of the benefits that just immediately kind of comes to mind when you're thinking about joining together, and why the motivation goes back to economics. So again, you're looking at improving your bargaining power. As you well know, due to your size or your scale, sometimes it just makes better sense to pool your resources together with other farmers, particularly if you're following standard production practices, if you're producing a quality product, things like that. We know that you can be more competitive when you pool your resources together. It also helps you to reduce costs. And as you know, any farmer is always interested in minimizing risk and reducing costs. And so working together tends to help that along as well. It also provides opportunities to expand marketing opportunities. And I think that's critically important as you're working as farmers. Everybody's concerned about that bottom line. And how can I market my product to buyers that are interested in what I'm growing? You also may be looking at improving your quality of products and services, as well as increasing your income. So all of those things kind of just, again, are ways in which we generally talk about when we're working with farmers and helping them to see the benefits of working together. But some of you are working in states that are very agriculture dependent. Some of you may be working in counties that are considered as agriculture powerhouses of the state. And so I felt like when you think about the things that you're doing as you're raising beef, cattle, and whatnot, sometimes it's good to kind of look at the context. You know, what is this industry that we're trying to navigate in? And so this is just some background information just to kind of give you some basis for why these farmers really felt like they needed to work together. So in North Carolina, right now, North Carolina, I think, ranks number 2 in hog production behind Iowa. But a lot of that hog production is really done in confinement operations. A lot of these operations are still family owned, but they really work at producing volume. And so confinement operation kind of lends to that. And so normally if it's a confinement, they're already contracted out to work with particular buyers. But even within that, there is definitely a growing market, a niche market out there for pasture pork. And so, and a lot of times, even though it represents such a small percentage of the overall market, these systems are often tied to a very specific premium market. So they may be working with local restaurants, they may be working with some of these novelty grocery stores, they may be doing direct sale, whatever the case might be. And so when you look at these counties right here, you can just understand what a small farmer would feel if they're working in a county that's really dominant in hog production. And you can see by the grade here that Sampson, Duplin, Bladen are some of the top producing pork counties in the state. And so it's important when we're looking at them is to say, well, how can you carve out a niche that would be sustainable but also profitable, knowing that they didn't have the volume that these confinement operations had? And what could they do to make themselves a little bit more attractive when you're working with premium markets, buyers and things like that? And so, like I said, just want to kind of give you that little bit of context because that matters at the end of the day. But it also talks about the viability of the market. So let's take a little look at the National Hog Growers Association. Again, like I said, we had worked with them really from the ground level in this process. And so, like I said, we wanted to take a few minutes so you can kind of understand their journey in terms of what it took for them to get started. And hopefully there'll be some parallels and some takeaways that you can use as you're looking at some things that you may want to do. And I thought it would be good to kind of do like a quick timeline. But basically what was going on here is that there were about 30 or so growers that were starting to raise hogs on pasture. And due to some educational support that they received from North Carolina A&T, they were able to begin to enter into a business arrangement with one of the top niche marketers out there at that time, which was Nyman Ranch. And so the growers back in 2002 had already started looking at ways that they could raise pork sustainably on pasture and how to do it under very strict like animal husbandry codes, because Nyman was very particular in terms of the protocol that they want the farmers to follow. But around 2006, they kind of got some unfortunate news where Nyman Ranch made the decision to pull out of their operations in North Carolina. And so it became very clear to these farmers that in a very short amount of time, they was going to be left without a market. And so we began working with them because we didn't really want to see them suffer because of the fact we know how important family farms are to our local economy. And because that relationship had already been established a few years ago through the relationship with Nyman and some of the technical support that we were providing at A&T, we did not want to lose this opportunity to help the pork producers to begin to navigate in terms of what do they need to do differently to market their product. And so it just gave us an opportunity again to work with them and to find a workable solution to access markets that they otherwise would not have been able to get if they would have acted alone. And then around fall 2007, we was able to receive some social disadvantaged grant funds to do an educational program working with pasture pork producers in general. That was the way that we started. We started by just working with them on a very consistent basis. We had already established these pasture pork grower schools that were held monthly. And so that brought the audience together on a regular basis. We also began to incorporate some trainings that dealt with cooperative development. We also did some strategic planning workshops with them and to kind of discuss the function of what a cooperative would look like or what a sound business structure would look like for farmers. And then we did some organizational development workshops. So when it got down to kind of understanding kind of the structure and the bylaws, the articles of incorporation, that took quite a bit of time as well. And then during this time, we also did some board training. So all of those things kind of builds the development of farmers to help them to see this thing as a process that they would manage, but really see it as a business entity. And then around 2008, we was able to kind of get things organized whereby the association was successfully formed, and we were beginning to look at markets and things like that they could access. So this is just for a visual for you all to know, the area that we worked in kind of reached from the northeastern part of the state, but majority of the production was in that southeast portion of the state. And this is just a snapshot of the volume when we assess, how many hogs are you actually growing out? When we asked them about their price range. So what are you getting for your hogs? What's the very low price? What's the very high price you've received? And that kind of gave us an idea in terms of revenue. Again, like I say, some of them already had experience working with Diamond Ranch. Half of them had already had experience being AWI certified, which is animal welfare approved. Again, that is a well-known standard, and it was really the baseline standard that all the farmers had to follow. And then depending on the particular buyer, there were other standards and other certifications that they had to abide by as well. But we definitely wanted them to be AWA certified. Again, it just helps them to kind of get closer to producing in a quality way, but in a standard way. When you look at questions, when we first started out, I went back to a resource that I came across from Rural Development, and it kind of dealt with some of the basic things you may want to know if you want to form into a cooperative. So I kind of used that as a guide when I started working with this group. These were the questions that I put out there, and these were the things that I was going to try to find an answer to before the group made a concerted decision to move forward. And so these are some questions that you may want to consider too, as you're looking at weighing your options in terms of what you would like to do. This is a picture here, a snapshot of one of our meetings. So I just want to kind of give you an idea of the makeup of the group. So when you look at some of the questions that I just talked about, is there an economic need? And that's very important when you really think about it. Like I say, when I go back to my opening statement, most cooperatives are formed out of an economic need. In this case, it was important to go ahead and identify what that need was. And so for our group, we knew that this group wanted to increase their earnings. They also wanted to aggregate their products so they would be more attractive to prospective buyers. And then they want to leverage. They want to have more leverage and bargaining power, typo. The second question was around, can the cooperative offer a solution? And so one thing that we ended up doing was begin to assess the potential members and to talk about what were their thoughts and feelings of such of an establishment. And so one of the things that we did was to look at if the cooperative could help us in helping the growers have more accountability in terms of producing sound, consistent production standards, right? Following those production standards. Because again, like I said, a lot of if you're raising on your own farm, there's certain things that you can control, of course. And there's certain things that you may prefer to do when it comes to raising your animals. But when you're working with a group of farmers, and if you're working with a premium market, one of the things that they would hit you hard on is consistent quality. It's like if I go to, say for instance, if you're producing apples, and we know that customers like a medium-sized to large apple, I, as a grower, cannot give whoever my buyer is small apples. So one of the things that we really had to work with our farmers was to help them to see that before they can ever get their foot in the door in working with a premium buyer was that they would have to be more consistent in terms of how they produce. The other thing was this facilitated information sharing. One of the things that the cooperative helped to facilitate was they had regular meetings, and from those regular meetings, there was a lot of information that was being shared. And so that was a good way for farmers to get their questions answered. If there was perspectives out there for the farmers to consider in terms of how to meet some of these standards, they had a discussion about that. If they wanted to bring a guest speaker in to talk about their cooperative structure, that was a way for them to get that done in a seamless way. If they were looking at buyers, sometimes we had buyers to come and talk about maybe some opportunities there. The other thing that the cooperatives was very helpful is playing a coordination role, because sometimes as growers, sometimes the only thing you're interested in is just raising your product, whatever that is. You don't really want to be caught up with all selling it. You don't want to be trying to figure out, you don't want to negotiate the price. You don't want to do any of that other stuff. But some of you may be okay in dabbling in different aspects of your business. But for the co-op can kind of help with some of those roles that I often have to play. So that was helpful for our growers and kind of just took the burden off of a sole proprietor. We looked at the interests, commonality. It was important to find commonality of interest beyond the producers. We also looked at whether the cooperative plan was feasible. And so we looked at some of the marketing opportunities. We knew that niche pork market was a growing market in North Carolina. We knew from previous experience working with Nyman Ranch, as well as some other buyers, that the returns were very good for small scale producers. And then we also knew that if we could show to growers that this could be a sound approach for them to get their product to the marketplace, we knew also that we could also get more growers to join. So those were some of the things that we looked at in terms of looking at the cooperative plan and looking at the feasibility. And then the other thing that we did was through the producer survey, it was clear that the growers were willing to market most of their hogs and also invest the necessary capital in the co-op to make it solvent. And so now I want you to think about your own situation. Kind of keeping in mind some of the things that I talked about, looking at the Natural Hog Growers Association. When I go back to the work that we did, we determined that it was an economic need, and it was obvious it was an economic need. So it was very clear, and we brought them together. We had a kind of like a listening session when it first happened. When we first got the news, we brought them together, and we really did like a SWOT analysis with them, kind of looking at the opportunities, the threats, some of their needs they had, and things like that. And we used that information as baseline information to figure out, okay, well, what should our next steps be? One of the things that we did pretty early on after we did a SWOT analysis, that we started having these meetings. And these meetings were really just a way to kind of explore the possibility of looking at this business structure as a solution to their current need. And so what was helpful is that out of that larger group that was part of that SWOT analysis, at the end of the meeting, I asked them, who would like to have some follow-up discussions in terms of looking at how this group could either work together to determine what the market opportunity would be for other swine producers. And so out of that meeting, about 10 people raised their hands, and from that meeting, those members ended up being the steering committee. So we just kind of worked in concert to kind of figure out the things that were kind of unknown at the time. So after you have determined there's an economic need, you may have to do maybe an exploratory meeting just to kind of get a sense of the barometer of what people may be interested in. Out of that, you definitely want a subgroup to kind of serve as a steering committee to kind of guide that work. The next part that you want to do is to look at this cooperative plan to see if it's feasible. And so one of the things that we did was we began to do, like I say, these very informal assessments. And this assessment was basically kind of looking at, well, who are the potential members? that we can possibly attract to this thing, what type of anticipated business that might be possible. And again, we're looking at volume, we're looking at what their willingness is to commit. If capital is needed, are they willing to maybe share some of that cost? And so we did like a very, very short survey just to kind of hit to some of those things. And then once we got that survey filled out, then I ended up calling on rural development. USDA has restructured a little bit, but during that time they had staff, dedicated staff that worked in their cooperative development office. And so I ended up reaching out to them, and then they also had asked that I reached out to another contact in DC because they had a cooperative development. They had professionals in Washington that worked in this area. So we began to have a conversation pretty early on, because it was looking like these members were kind of leaning in this direction, but we still needed some more hard data. And we wanted to put some more structure around, if we was going to do some type of market analysis work, what would that look like for the group? And so we ended up creating a survey that kind of dealt with some of that market analysis. Again, these are some of the things that we talked about in terms of what are some of the activities the cooperative can help with, what is the anticipated business volume, market potential, what are some of the other needs that members may have. We also looked at just a host of things. In addition to that, we also looked at them creating a business plan. When it was becoming very clear that there was definitely there was capacity in that area to form, we also looked at, I worked with them in drafting their legal papers, their bylaws, the articles of incorporation. That took a few meetings to get those things hashed out, but we got those done. Once the group approved the bylaws, we ended up submitting those bylaws to the North Carolina State Department, I think, and then we were able to get them filed, and then it was able to get their, ID number and all that. And so shortly thereafter, they decided that they was going to elect their board of directors. Majority of the people that was on the steering committee ended up serving on the board for that first couple of years, because they had a lot of the history. And so a lot of the growers who were new to the cooperative, they really trusted the farmers who kind of had paved the way and did a lot of the background work and things of that nature. And so we got that done. And then they began meeting. And so one of the things they did to make it easy on the farmers, I had told you that we had started doing these pasture pork grower schools. And so what they decided to do, that they ended up having their regular face-to-face meeting before the grower school. And so that kind of gave them more consistent schedule to work from. Any questions so far?
Yeah, Dr. Eley, this is Doug DeVoe. I have a question. So how did you guys finance the startup?
Well, it wasn't too much to finance. One of them, they were very clear about not getting in further debt. So they were really cautious in terms of not spending unnecessary money. So a lot of things that we did, it wasn't any cost to them, like meeting with them and bringing those resources, different people that work with them when we was trying to do the various meetings. What happened was, that there's going to be, with a cooperative, there is a cost in terms of, I think, it depends on your structure. Sometimes there's per unit retains that you may put on product that is sold through the cooperative, and that may be a fixed amount that you may pay per animal. So that's revenue that comes in to the cooperative. But then too, some cooperatives have dues. So you can decide if you want to have dues, that might be an added expense, things like that. But it really wasn't much expense that they incurred in terms of formalizing. Some groups like to have managers, and that was a question that came up when we were trying to figure out capacity. If you don't deal with have to hire anybody to serve as a manager, if the farmers decide that they want to share that responsibility in managing the operational cooperative, that keeps your costs down too. They shared a lot of things. They did a lot of things in kind for one another. So barter, trade, you name it, they did it. So that's how they kind of figured it. They've kind of figured things out that way. But I feel like if you're going to do an assessment, you may want to begin to consider what those costs might be and see how the potential members may feel about it. Really, there wasn't really a whole lot of cost to get them established. It didn't, in terms of on them, they didn't incur a lot of costs.
Dr. Eley, question for you. What was the time frame from the start of you wanting to do this to actual completion? And second question is, what were the IRS considerations in this? Because that's one of the things that people worry about if you have a cooperative. Is it self-taxed? Is it a corporate entity taxed alone? Does it flow down to your personal taxes?
Definitely. Yeah, those kind of questions. You know, we work with a lawyer and accountant. So I would say if you're thinking about this, definitely have someone who can work with you on those concerns. Now this cooperative was set up as a nonprofit cooperative. So they weren't taxed on the state side, but they realized that they did have some issues on the federal side. So one of the things that I would say to you is to make sure as you're thinking about incorporation and taxation and things like that, is to really do it under the consultation of a lawyer and accountant to figure out what the structure needs to be so you will not incur additional taxes. The association president, I'm pretty sure that he has to file something on behalf of the cooperative, but the farmers, I've never heard that the farmers had to file something separate. Of course, as a farmer, you have to report your income either way. So that it does not negate that. You still are reporting. So when you, for example, if the cooperative is working with a buyer, the buyer, depending on the arrangement of that marketing agreement, the buyer is either going to pay you independently or they're going to pay the cooperative. A lot of times the farmers want their own arrangement. So in this case, a lot of times what has happened when we work with the ag group, they receive the money directly from the buyer. It was I can't think of a situation where the buyer paid the co-op and then the co-op had to distribute those funds. So as you're receiving that income, you report that income like you naturally would anyway. And then based on that, you could get taxed, of course. But we was trying to prevent the tax liability on the co-op. And so that was the reason why we looked at setting up as a nonprofit. In terms of the process, it took us about 10 months, start to finish. From the time we met with them and did that SWOT analysis and had maybe a meeting after that meeting, from that time to the time they got incorporated, it probably took us about 10 months. And that's including the assessments that we did with the potential growers. We kind of did like a little mini feasibility plan, trying to get the articles in court finalized and filed, all of that. But we met with them every month. I mean, like 2 and sometimes twice a month if it was needed.
Michelle, Dr. Nobi here.
Yes.
You know, I remember going down to those farmers to visit with them because there was a lot of changes from when they first got started till when I left there. I was there in 2005 when we first started hearing about that. Were they charging each other's dues? What did they do? Then the dues go away? How did they handle that?
I want to say they had dues, and I have to go back to the articles in court to kind of clarify that. But I know they did per unit retains. And again, that was like a fixed dollar amount. It was like maybe $1 on each animal that was sold. So say for instance, if a farmer had a shipment of 20 hogs, and they did 2 shipments of 20 hogs per month, then they had to write a check or however they did a payment to the co-op to pay for 40. They owed the co-op $40, and every farmer did that. And that was helpful for them to kind of deal with some of the operational costs. And then about a year or 2 in, they were able to write a couple of grants, but they never was in the red. They always had money in the bank. But as far as the county, they really didn't have any issues, but they were very conservative. They didn't really spend a lot of money. They really didn't. They was just very determined about not abusing the structure, I guess. So they just didn't spend a lot. They just was very conservative from that standpoint.
Michelle, hey, it's Niki. I thought I remember talking to Jeremiah once, and he was saying that they did have dues, and it was different, maybe depending on which markets you decided to sell into, because they had some markets that paid more but required more things, and then they had some that were easier to sell into. So I guess there's a lot of different options that they consider in that.
Exactly. And those are things as the farmers, they can kind of work through. You know, before the group decided to work with anyone, we had a conversation with these buyers and kind of get a sense of what's really required and how much time would it take for me to work with the co-op or to work with you as an entity. And I agree with you. I think there was some things they decided to do at the beginning, and they had to make some adjustments, like you were saying, Niki. Some buyers required more. It took more work to get the product to them. And so along the way, they would make changes and things of that nature to compensate for the time that was being extended to make it happen.
I think another analogy that I see between that group and this group here is that they had got to the point that they were moving about $1 million in product. And so the co-op was really making money from every animal sold through the cooperative. Some of it would go back to them.
Right.
And they got to the point that their product was so consistent, the members had to agree on what males you bought. So they dictated the boards. They went out to Minnesota, brought boards back. So between James and the rest of you fellas, Andy, they were controlling the genetics a little bit.
Right.
There wasn't nobody bringing any kind of male in there doing stuff with it. But that's because and they had one person doing the marketing.
Right.
One person would go to Whole Foods. One person would go to Publix. And when they speak on behalf of the cooperative, they must look like any hog from any farm and come from the same farm. That's how consistent they want that product. They're moving $1 million at the end.
Yeah. And again, you raised a good point. I didn't really talk about that. Like when they first got started, we were able to capitalize on working with Whole Foods. And so Whole Foods ended up being a lifeline to them in terms of accessing what I define as a premium market. But we knew too that some of the farmers weren't ready to compete with Whole Foods. Still working, tinkering with their production standards. They were working on their quality. Quality was such a sticking point for them. And that was one of the things that was hard to manage. And so they had to work really creatively to find other markets. And so some of them were working with some local, some smaller restaurants, one kind of mid-scale, high-end, I guess, restaurant. But then some of them were selling at Weaver Street, which is a cooperative grocery store. We also had some working with a food truck vendor. So they were kind of looking at multiple things. At the same time, they knew that Whole Foods, those that were willing to work with Whole Foods, that was going to really be their main market. But they knew that the smaller markets was helpful for operators who really still was trying to get things kind of in a more standardized way. Just really quickly, of the principles of cooperative, you're either going to be specialized in marketing, buying supplies, or providing services. And in your case, you're probably going to be doing some marketing and looking at quality and things like that, quality control and things like that. And so I think for you, it's just to begin to look at those things. We know that cooperatives are owned and controlled by their members, and it's really a democratic control. So each member has a vote, and that vote matters. You definitely have autonomy and independence in the work that you're doing. But the other thing too is that because you're working in a group, you share in the profits and you share in the losses. And a lot of that is going to stem from the amount of business that you're going to generate within that cooperative. Also, like I told you before, cooperatives are a good platform to provide education, training, information. Again, like I said, I feel like farmers thrive when they can have the right information to act and to make the decisions that they need to make as relates to their farm operation. I feel like most ag cooperatives are concerned about the community, because at the end of the day, that dollar that is being generated at the local level circulates it supports other businesses at the local level. As you know, in the ag industry, there's a lot of vendors that you work with, and that they are supportive of the things that you're doing. And so there is a general concern in making sure that our local communities are economically viable. And so cooperatives can help generate that too. And then, of course, we can't stress enough about cooperation. It is not about you or somebody else down the street. It's about the group. How can we make decisions that's going to be at the benefit of the group? And so it does take a lot of cooperation. The thing that we had to work with was trust. Farmers don't always trust each other. And so you got to kind of deal with that when that comes up, you know. And then too, some of these farmers didn't have a relationship of working with one another. So it took a while for people to feel comfortable. But at the end of the day, we try to make sure that the members remain transparent as much as they could, and make sure that there was processes in place to deal with questions, concerns as they came up. Again, like I say, some of the advantages, again, most farmers are interested in mitigating risk. And so I think cooperatives do help in that way. Again, you have equal share in the cooperative. So that's the reason why the equity word is in there, is that everybody has the same level of ownership, control, whatever you want to call it. Some of the disadvantage is that sometimes the decision making could be a little bit slower than what you're used to. But again, if you're working in a group, you have to make sure that everybody's on the same accord. And so sometimes it did take a little bit longer to get things done, because, you know, people just work at different levels. You may have to repeat things 3 or 4 different times. I remember when we started talking about cooperatives, I probably had like 2 or 3 meetings on what a cooperative was before we said, okay, this is what we're doing. Are we calling it something else? What are we calling it? And so sometimes you have to kind of prepare yourself for that. Funding challenges, I think you have to decide what are some of the costs you would incur by coming together, and try to figure out, is that something can be absorbed by each of you all carrying your own weight, or do you have to bring someone from the outside in, you know, so, or find external resources to accommodate that cost. Some cooperatives need money to operate. But like I say, I've seen it in our case where, you know, that of course you want to have money for operating costs, but you don't need a lot of outside money, I guess is what I'm saying. And then again, profit and well-being will depend on the level of participation. So holding people accountable was something that the board and the association president had to do, you know. And like I say, one day it may be on quality, another theme, it might be on something else. But that thing that I can't stress enough is that if you're going to work together, you got to be on the same accord when it comes to what you're offering to the marketplace. You cannot say you're going to do one thing and then provide something else, because that's going to affect your bottom line. And then it can cause, like I say, some issues down the road in terms of, you know, building that rapport and establishment, you know, with prospective buyers and things like that. This is just some factors that kind of help cooperatives to be successful, is definitely identifying the economic need, coming to agreement in terms of how this cooperative is going to serve farmers at large and the community. You know, really understanding why are you operating in concert with one another, and what would be the driving factor that's going to keep you all together. Having good leadership, you know, it's important to kind of look at your leadership structure and who is good at doing certain things. As Dr. Nova says, sometimes things had to be delegated out within a cooperative. And so I think it's important that your board and your association, your officers, really exemplify good leadership skills, because I think at the end of the day, that makes a difference. And they represent you, you know, and we want them to feel comfortable, and when they're representing the business of the cooperative, that they can kind of navigate in different settings and things of that nature. Gaining commitment of members to do business is very key. And then just make sure that you're following sound business practices. And when I say that, I can't overemphasize that business practices also ties back to your production practices. And this is just a snapshot of two of our members. Jeremiah Jones, he was the youngest guy in the group, and he ended up being he was the youngest, and he was the most quiet person in the group. Didn't really say that much, but he ended up being the association president when it came time for them to vote. And the reason why he was chosen was because he was steadfast, and he understood, he had a good grasp of what the market needed in terms of quality. And he was one of those ones that was with us at the beginning. When I told you about those 10 members that was part of that steering committee, he was one out of that 10. And being consistent, meaning that he came to all of the meetings, he took a lot of notes. When he wanted to voice his concerns, he did, but wasn't really overly talkative at all. Just kind of listened. So he ended up playing a critical role. He still serves as association president, and he just really had a knack of working with these buyers and kind of speaking on behalf of the members and things of that nature. So he facilitated a role that some of the farmers were intimidated to do. He's also had a master's degree in ag. That sometimes you can utilize some of the skills that you learn in school. So like I say, he just kind of had the ability to lead the organization. But at the onset, I would never would have guessed it would have been him. But I saw the growth as we continue to work with him. The other person is Ron Simmons. And so Ron Simmons was one of those farmers. He was a young buck too. I met him maybe a couple of years after the cooperative had gotten established. And he ended up coming to a co-op meeting one night, and I was at that meeting. And he ended up just coming because he ended up talking to another farmer who was also part of co-op. And he was like, well, I'm trying to get in this pasture-based hog production, but I really don't know how to start. I'm just trying to get my feet wet. And so they had said, well, you probably want to come to this meeting to learn about what we're doing. And he eventually joined the co-op. And after joining the co-op, he started to look at his production standards, try to figure out, how do I really produce this quality product? He looked at his breeding stock, things like that. And from that growth, from being a part of that co-op, he realized that he could do some things competitively in his area, but he was interested in diversifying. And so he found out raising barbecue hogs was a way for him to increase his income and become more flexible in selling smaller hogs while he was trying to grow out the larger hogs. Because you know how it is when you're raising something to full market weight, it could be months. And so that helped him to tweak some things in terms of his feed consumption or conversion, his genetics. And so he started doing custom cuts. And then the custom cuts was an offset to raising the whole hog, right? Selling the whole hog. And then from there, he ended up taking some leadership classes, learning a little bit more about what he could do. And then he ended up getting a RAFI grant to create retail space on his farm. And that retail space ended up being a small store. And the store is cute as it can be. So he not only sells his product, but he also sells other novelty items that you can buy for your home. And it was just a way, again, to connect to the local consumers there in his community, but also source, some local product from not only his business, but other farm businesses. And so he has done extremely well, and he's given back to the community. And so because of his work, he ended up getting nominated for the Small Farm of the Year in 2018. So I just want to give you that profile and let you know that it can work. It does take a little bit of time to get it all sorted out, but I feel like the time that you use to work together to determine how the co-op is going to function is going to be the foundation in terms of how successful that co-op is going to be. So that's really all I wanted to share, but I wanted to just at least give you that overview. And if I can provide any more feedback at a later date, I'm happy to do that too. But I just wanted to share that with you.
we're going to try to gather some more information so we can identify those that are specifically interested in some of the programs involved in marketing. Because there are different types of marketing, and Michelle was talking about the cooperative itself had different markets, and then there were markets outside of the cooperative that some of the members sought after and obtained. And so we're here at Fort Valley to help you guys, no matter what type of market you may want to try to enter, and try to get you to where you're comfortable marketing within those programs. We do know that marketing together is a good way to get the numbers that you may need for some of the larger markets. And if we can help y'all in that, we'll do that as well. Anybody have any other questions for Dr. Eley?
Yes, this is Rodney. My question was, it's kind of likened to trucking as far as having your own authority when you're targeting different vendors. Just because you hadn't been in existence long enough, although you can meet their requirements, you don't have a track record, so they don't want to give you the business. And I was wondering, with a new cooperative or a startup cooperative, are you met with the same or similar challenges from the commercial side, the state side, or the local side?
I guess from the experiences that we had working with the National Hog Growers Cooperative, you know, what gave them a leg up was it wasn't so much of them being new. It was because they were following. We really worked with them being AWA certified, and then we also did the TQA, PQA certifications, I believe, with them too. And so I felt like because they were following at least those basic minimum standards, the people start looking at them. You know? So they didn't really have any issues being newly formed, but it was just helping them to see that if they met some of the basic standards, quality standards when it comes to raising animals on pasture and raising animals a humane way and things like that, that was enough to open the door for them. So I think in your instance, or in the collective instance, I think for you all is to kind of figure out what is it that the market is demanding when it comes to producing a quality product, and can you meet that demand? Because if you can meet that demand, then you won't have any problems getting your foot in the door. The problem is when you're working as a sole proprietor, you don't have volume. People need consistent volume and consistent quality. So that's where the barriers comes in when you're working solo versus working with a group. In some markets, you can't even get your foot in the door unless you can prove that you're producing a consistently quality product, and that you can produce the volume. Some doors just don't even open unless you can master those two things. And so that group had a track record because they had already worked with Nyman. So not saying that they didn't have to learn some new things, but I felt like for them is that they were able to do those two things that I just named. They were able to provide a certain number of hogs, and they also could document based on their records that they were producing the hogs in a way that was attractive to the buyer, you know. Is the reason of what? Okay, so tell me this: what would be the reason for you all forming to a cooperative?
Yes, I would think the first would be economics, and then the second would be volume. But we all know that the only market that probably 90% of us have is basically to the local sale barns. And so, when you take local sale barns, your profit is low, non-existent. And so we just really want the opportunity to create more markets, whether we're selling directly to feedlots, and maybe look at some grocery stores and restaurants.
But yeah, so in that case, that mirrors. So for you, the thing is that you want to provide the economics will come if you got good quality product. I'm telling you that right now. Right. So that's that. So don't chase the dollar per se, chase the quality.
Right.
that's where you won't have to work the hardest to maintain.
Yeah.
So what standards is approved in the marketplace to say that you produce a quality product? So looking at those standards, I know AWA they work with cattlemen too. So, across the board. So I don't know if any of you are at least following those standards by chance. But if you're not, that might be a good place to start. So I think the first question is to look at the interest, to see if there's interest or viability for people to come together. But again, that quality question, can we produce, can we all agree to produce our cattle in a uniform way,
right,
in a way that would be recognized by the marketplace, but also to those buyers that you want to attract, and just understanding what the requirements would be to meet those standards. And then from there, if you could get that mastered, the money would be there.
Yes, we agree. We know that. I think right now DQA is probably the standard for the beef. I know that's going to be the bare minimum requirement. But hopefully we can get farmers working together to produce a consistent quality using good genetics and doing the standard that we're going to lay out, taking our cows from high risk to low risk, and what all that incorporates in. Yeah.
So we had to think about a valuable buyer down the road for our farmers. Who would that be? And maybe having a conversation with them and just saying, do you have a relationship working with small scale producers? Are you interested in working with farmer co-ops? What would be your barriers to working with a group such as us? What are some of the standards, minimal standards, do we have to abide by to even be in consideration to work with you? So, not saying that you're ready, but you're just trying to get the information so you can begin to take it in and figure out, well, how I'm going to utilize this information. Is this where we want to go? Do we want to work with someone else? Do we feel like we can meet it? Those are things that I feel, but you kind of have to know what you're striving for.
Yeah, we have to have a target.
Okay. And I feel, and definitely the production, you got it. Yeah, you don't want to be dealing with a lot of high risk animals. If you're gonna, you got to treat it as a business. So what I need to do to make my business more profitable and take personal ownership of it from that standpoint? Because when you're working with other people, they're gonna be thinking you're doing the same thing. And if you ain't doing the same thing, it's gonna show up in the meetings.
So do you think that, as I mentioned, pods will work? Just say if I want to get with about 5 farmers in my area, we get together and we basically say, okay, our target is that we're going to shoot for, say internet sales, and then maybe some other states do the same thing. Would that work as a cooperative? Where we all come together as one group, or that's really challenging to work in such a large area?
Well, I would say start with an assessment. I'm an economist by heart, so I'm always like, can I get some data? So I would just do an assessment first, just to see where you are, where the interest might be, where the volume would be. Then from there, you can decide if does a pod situation work better for us, because there might be some clustering that comes from the data to say you can pinpoint where your clusters are based on what your data tells you. I can definitely see the benefit of working in clusters, but I guess, again, if you're still working in clusters, you need to, whoever you're working with, like the buyer, if they're concerned about quality, you want to make sure that your cluster is doing basically the same thing.
So like each cluster would have the same standards.
Yeah.
If you're going to all market under the same banner. But, either way, what you're saying is the key is having standards, and everybody has to try to follow those. Whether, and like you said, the growers didn't start off at that level. And
that's why we started with the grower schools, because we knew that people were at different levels. And so that was our way of providing education to them, for they could understand how they can make those proactive changes. That's one reason why we kept those in for so long.
They were very effective, I
They
think.
were. And
No,
we
it's
could have done, I think every little step mattered. It really did. I mean, we don't want to make it seem like you're doing it by yourself. You, as a group, you need to leverage the knowledge that you can and the expertise you can get from Extension. There's some things that they can help you do, or at least facilitate for you to do. But then there's other entities too that you can work with. I know when I did a cooperative, I probably worked with 5 different entities. I leveraged as much as I could to build the infrastructure that was needed because I knew I didn't have all the knowledge. And so in the same way, I think part of this, we don't want you to feel like you're trying to build this in a vacuum. It's really looking at critically of what is it that we feel we can ascertain by working together. And then based on that, you got to have some goals or some benchmarks that you're striving for. But again, if you're in the business of increasing your bottom line or the income, then it's going to tie back down to who you're supplying, who are you furnishing that product to, and your quality. So I guess it's just trying to figure out in this group if there's a willingness for us to look at standards. It could be, as a group, can we help each other elevate our production standards in a way that would give us the dividends we want to receive? Okay, right. So, kind of looking at what markets do you want to penetrate, what's needed to access those markets, and can we rise to the occasion to do it? Looking at the capacity that we have as a body. But also you got to look at what you're doing individually, but what can we do by, kind of like I say, aggregating and kind of working together. The thing is, you can do a lot more than what you think, but I feel like you can do so much more if you can see the value of getting out of your comfort zone, but knowing that there's power in working together with other people. And as small farmers, we got to think about that.
Very good.
Any other final questions before we let Dr. Eley go for the evening? All righty. Well, we appreciate your time. We appreciate our participants' time. And we want them to know that just because this is the last one in this session doesn't mean that we're going to forget about them. We're going to have some follow-up informational sessions and probably host meetings in between. And then we'll have another virtual session that starts up in the early spring, we hope. So everybody look out for that. Check your emails for information and let us know if you need anything.
So again, thank you all so much for participating and look forward to seeing you again in the next series.
I think the presentation today was uniquely valuable to us. Dr. Eley didn't have the skills that you see common among the 1890 schools. That's why I was happy to see her on the program. We can find a replication of people that do production, herd health, reproduction, nutrition. But in community development and working with a successful cooperative, she probably has a unique perspective we need to try to capitalize on. So,
yes, very much so.
I just want to say thank you to Fort Valley. We really appreciate y'all engaging in these calls, and just really appreciate Dr. Whitley for reaching out to the presenters. It's been outstanding. I know I speak on behalf of everybody. I learned a lot and really look forward to moving forward in this program. So thank everybody, and thank the participants for joining. I really appreciate everybody who work in this space and trying to help us move us in the right direction. Thanks a lot.